I don't know what the implications will be. I don't know what cool new things we will create, but there's going to be some subset of humanity that's going to continue to be creative, and that's going to create these new things that we can't even imagine today, that are going to appeal to and attract the attention of everybody else. From the perspective of someone in the Middle Ages, the whole concept of a Renaissance fair, the ability to go somewhere for the weekend and pretend that you're living in Roman times or something, right, would seem crazy. But for us, large groups of us, it's not, right?
Hi, my name is Dimitri Panici, and I'm a content creator, agency owner, and AI enthusiast. You're listening to the AI Agents Podcast, brought to you by Jotform, and featuring our very own CEO and founder, Ida Tank. This is the show where artificial intelligence meets innovation, productivity, and the tools shaping the future of work. Enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the AI Agents Podcast. In this episode, we have Mark from Autom8ly. How you doing, Mark?
Doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm living the dream. You always got to be living the dream. But no, I appreciate you for spending the time with us today. We're going to be chatting about Autom8ly, and I think a great starting point would just be, how did you get to where you're at with Autom8ly? Or, well, first of all, what does Autom8ly do, and how did you get to where you're at with it right now?
So Autom8ly, we build AI automation solutions. We like to focus on building the coolest AIs, talking AIs, and AIs that do, anonymization. We have AIs that do SEO for large media companies. We have different solutions that we've built for folks, and we're kind of geeky, so we like to focus on building the cool AIs and finding partners in different verticals that help us identify, what it is that the trucker needs from AI, and then we help build it. They help sell it, and we kind of go to market that way in different verticals.
Makes sense. Okay. So how long have you guys been in business?
Autom8ly got founded in early 24, so about a year and a half for Autom8ly. But I've built and sold 7 companies over the years. I've just kind of have always built technology companies. That's kind of what I do. So, I've been doing AI for 20 years because I spent a lot of time in video games where it was more common. And then kind of in 23, when we kind of turned the curve on GPT and just kind of, the price of compute and the price of the chips just got to where it suddenly became reasonable to get this stuff done in a business context. I got really interested in what does AI look like post-adoption. I'm old enough here to have experienced a few technology waves, and it's always the case that technology moves really fast, but adoption moves really slow. So what I always try to figure out is, what's it going to look like in 4 or 5 years when we actually go through all the adoption and all the pain and suffering, and we're actually using it each and every day. And that's kind of what Autom8ly is our experiment to try and figure out what that looks like when the world catches up.
What do you think that it will look like when the world catches up?
So, right now the narrative is really around GPT and agents, which for a lot of people kind of suggest autonomy. And I actually think that, of course, that will exist, but I actually think a lot of AI and a lot of the way it's going to happen will be what I call cooperative AI. So these are AI agents that work side by side with people rather than, replacing people, as it were. I think there's a few reasons for that. I think at a very simple level, people don't want to buy from bots. People want to buy from people. I joke with folks that if you're my plumber, I don't care what brand of wrench you use. I want to know that you'll be there at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night when my water heater explodes, right? If you're my lawyer, I'm not just buying the work product you do. I'm buying your insurance. I'm buying your license. I'm buying the resources of your firm. I'm buying your liability, right? I'm buying all of that stuff, as well as the contract or the piece of paper that you can produce. And so that's not going to get replaced, right? So I believe that actually this kind of cooperative AI, where it's an acceleration tool for people rather than a replacement for people, is going to be where most of the growth and where most of the eventual adoption will be. The other cool part about a cooperative AI is it lets us get there much further, much faster. And we can go later around kind of like our methodology for how we implement AIs if you want. But the fundamental reality is, it's very hard to get to 100% accuracy, but you can get a lot of leverage from 50% accuracy or 70% accuracy or 90% accuracy if you have a workflow that accounts for it. And if the cooperation between the AI and the person is structured in such a way that the person injects that extra 10% or 30% of their know-how, their experience, on top of the busy work that the AI can get accomplished.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Do you know what the reason is that we're kind of behind, or not behind? Why we're closer to 50% maybe, or 75% than we are to 100% accuracy?
I think that there's a few different reasons for it. I think that the first reason is measuring success. So step 3 of our 9-step plan is always kind of figuring out, how do you even measure success for AI inference, right? Like, if you decide that you want an AI to do something, sounds simple enough. But when you actually ask the question of, okay, how do you measure the level of success that you achieved in doing this? Often it's very difficult. So if you can't measure something, it's very hard to achieve good success in it, because you don't know what success looks like. So that's kind of a big barrier. People think they know, they intuitively kind of, they know it when they see it, but when you try to actually put some qualifiers around it, or like quantify that measurement, it's really tough. And so what happens is, you get part of the way there, then you get some feedback from the consumer, the human experience, right? Then we can incorporate that feedback back in and get to 51% next time, and then 55%, right? Getting to 100, if you don't know what 100 really looks like in technical terms, is almost impossible.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And what has been the hardest part of you trying to explain that to the average person dealing with you in your work? Because I can imagine that's kind of a bit of a struggle to explain, because the AI industry right now almost feels like this like amalgamous, like esoteric, like solution bot, and nobody really practically understand, or well, not nobody. People who aren't in our bubble don't practically understand the implications of what requests mean and how hard they actually are to be perfectly accurate.
I think a lot of the problem is actually us, the technology people. We're used to 15, 20 years of selling SaaS solutions, with the word being, kind of solution, right? So we're used to, like, okay, I'm going to sell you a tool, and so this tool must work, right? So it's like, here's the solution. But actually, that's not what we do with AI. AI is statistical. AI is not deterministic. AI is never finished. And so we set ourselves up for failure if we go into a client and say, hey, I'm going to give you a tool to do X, because implied in that is perfection, right? When we come in and we talk to potential customers, we have this language that we use around, think of an AI as a colleague rather than as a tool, right? If you hired a new person, the first thing you do is you'd give them, all your manuals, which, if you're lucky, capture 70% of what they need to actually know about their job, right? And then they shadow somebody for a while, and that person goes, oh, and by the way, the forks are kept here. Oh, by the way, don't forget to take the slop bucket out every night. That's not in the manual. And then you start giving them little jobs with close supervision. Then you give them bigger jobs with a little less supervision. And over time, you kind of set them loose until they're ready to contribute. And in some jobs, that could be 6 hours. And in some jobs, like if you're a nuclear power operator, that's a 5-year cycle of getting to the level of confidence where you actually leave the guy or the gal at the console by themselves. We talk about our AIs in exactly the same way, right? So when we deploy an AI solution, yes, we take the documentation. Yes, we ingest some past communication for modeling, but then we also select the tasks we start with so that they are subject to close supervision. As I mentioned earlier, very early in the process, we identify what are the measurements of success for the task. And then as the task is performed, we develop what we call a confidence metric. And that confidence metric is then used to drive the level of independence or autonomy that you can then give the AI. But then you base your decision about how much autonomy to give the AI on an actual metric that's derived from what you're achieving, rather than cross your fingers, hope for the best, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. Like, my understanding of these tools is one thing, and then the gap, I do feel like it's fair enough that we as the tech people do need to kind of provide an accurate representation. And most of what I think we're being sold actually doesn't really probably come from people in your position. It's more of the Sam Sam Altman, OpenAI, the Microsofts of the world that are trying to claim like it is something above what it is. Like, for example, you were probably familiar with the operator, ChatGPT operator. Like that product's fail rate is like 60% or something stupid, right? Yeah. But that wasn't mentioned, in any of the news press about it or by OpenAI or the, companies that would necessarily be meant to, talk about it. So I think that's a fair point. It's actually kind of on us to dial back the frame of reference as to like, or is this thing actually going to be able to do whatever we want immediately? So good point there.
And I think there's actually two layers to that, right? Like one is the tool capable, right? And so obviously GPT has gotten better, less hallucination, this and that, but it's still not perfect, right? Um, but the other thing we're experiencing, I think that's underappreciated is, and we saw this in the rollout of cell phones too, right? The capabilities that you can have for yourself in your own life with AI far exceeds any capabilities that you can have in an enterprise setting right now. So on top of what you're talking about, right? I can go and I can generate video and I can use GPT and I can do all this cool stuff for myself that if I work for a Fortune 500, I have trouble doing in a corporate context because there's all the other complexity. There's the liability and the disclosure and the, you know, trust in the data and things that an enterprise has to worry about that's actually layered on top of even the performance, right? So just like when we started having smartphones, right? We all carried smartphones, but our company said no smartphones because we don't know how to deal with them and we don't know how to, track the email and keep track of the text messages and the liability and blah blah blah, right? So I think there's two modes to that failure. One is yes, absolutely. Even for you using GPT yourself, it's not as predictable or it's not as completely accurate as you'd like it to. But then layer on top of that, the investor relations guy who has to have an embargo for 30 days before the quarterly earnings, how he feels about like GPT being available to people inside the organization, or like the head of compliance or the head of security, right? So there's huge failures across the entire system. So when we go in and say we have a tool that will do XYZ, like that is so likely to fail without a little more information, to your point, that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot when we go in with that kind of tool mentality, I feel.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like a lot of people don't appreciate the personal aspect as much in our space and in like general business space because we are so focused on what it can do for business. But at the enterprise level, there's a lot of this red tape. No, you're not wrong at all. I actually realized recently I've just gotten back into just fitness more and more, and like just on a personal level, there's so many people who are selling this or that app, for example, for like macro tracking, and I'm like, why would I do that if I can just like open up 4.1 or 4.0 and enable web search and just be like, track my macros for today. I'm going to keep texting you I'm going to keep sending a message of what I ate throughout the day. And it'll be like 90% accurate. And like, for all intents and purposes, I'm fine with that considering it's what my goals are. So, but for a company, right, that 10% at an enterprise level can be the make or break point of efficacy or not.
Absolutely. And if you're a hospital, right, you need to be a little more accurate, right? If you're a nutritionist in a hospital that's, minding somebody who's very sick, you need, 4 nines confidence.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So with Autom8ly, how are you helping people nowadays? I guess dive into some examples of how you are bridging this gap to kind of like modernize businesses with secure and transparent AI.
So I'll give you an example. My favorite one. So we focus on building really cool AIs, and I don't believe that we can be really good at cool AIs and really focused on a particular vertical. Because once you start getting into a particular market or vertical, you start having to dive into the nuances of that market, and you kind of lose contact with this very rapidly evolving AI universe. So our go-to-market is we actually like to find partners, people who are in different verticals who really understand those verticals, who have the contacts, who are at the trade shows. They may not know how to build an AI, but they understand how the AI can add value into that space. And we partner with them to offer services into that space. So one of the people that we found is in trucking, which I love because it is conceptually the least techy of all industries, right? You kind of think of it as being very blue collar, right? And with the help of this person, this partner, we identified a couple of use cases which are incredible. But my favorite one is, it turns out that all these truck drivers, it tends to be a lot of mom and pop operations. They're sitting there in the truck all day long, driving from point A to point B, and they spend most of their time on the phone calling all of these different brokers, trying to find the next load, right? So these brokers are sitting, taking hundreds of calls a day, and less than 5% of those calls will actually resolve into a deal because that guy won't be there in time. He's got the wrong kind of vehicle. He doesn't have the correct licenses. There's a myriad of nuances that make somebody the right fit or the wrong fit. And so we, the one use case he identifies is basically having a phone answering AI that can ask, the first 10 questions that the user is going to ask anyway, and filter out 90% of the calls so that those brokers can focus on the 10% that might actually result in a real deal and do a better job of it, and also free up some of their time to do more selling, right? Because that's the other thing they're trying to do at the same time. So there's an example of a use case where we've kind of identified, with the help of a distribution partner, something that brings real value, real incremental value to a particular industry, a particular use case. It doesn't have to be super accurate. It's not really a make or break. It's not life or death. It's just helping filter through some of the most obvious time wasters. We did another voice bot, or through a different partner, we identified another use case, and this is for managed service providers. So these are people who provide like IT services for small to medium companies. And we were talking to one in particular, and he told us that 70% of their phone call volume was, "I forgot my password." Right? The agents hate answering those calls because they're boring. The business hates answering those calls because there's no upsell opportunity for "I forgot my password," right? My email server is running too slow is an upsell opportunity. "I forgot my password" is not an upsell opportunity. It's just, I need to reset your password. And the people who forgot the password don't want to wait on hold for the agent to free up. So literally a voice agent that can go through the checklist of questions that the human agent would go through, and just, "Oh, if you need to change your password, let me help you," right? Everything else goes to the human agent. Another great use case where can we build a voice agent that will do all tech support? Yeah, we probably can. But again, we're, getting to 100% is really hard. This is 20% of the work, 70% of the call volume. The caller is happier, the agent is happier, and the company's getting more valuable time out of their agents, right? So again, like identifying these opportunities and helping companies be more successful by delivering like properly scoped problems. Don't need to boil the ocean, don't need to be 100%, just need to find what the right efficacy, what the right confidence level is, understanding that it's not going to be perfect, but also it doesn't need to be perfect in this use case.
I have a question I think that might be interesting then with that. I liked your phrase, by the way, not boiling the ocean. I haven't heard that one before. That's pretty good. I think with this kind of adjustment that we're having in the workforce, it's always a focus, it seems like, from the general public that work is going to be decreased in regards to like actual jobs, right? Like this is taking jobs. Because how you framed it was interesting. It was almost like those that are working are going to actually have more enjoyment out of their job. They're going to get more out of it. They're going to do calls that aren't ridiculous, like "I forgot my password." What would be your commentary on that whole situation? Because I do think it's one of those more hot button, interesting topics where everybody's always jockeying for the high ground of what is the right way to look at this. Is AI going to steal all their jobs? Is it going to make way for better and more interesting jobs for people? How do you think it's going to impact the job market in the next 5 years?
So I think that of course there will be displacement, right? Like this is a fundamental unpleasant fact that there will be displacement. Some people who are doing some work, it is going to be displaced. Displaced doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to find a job, but displaced means you may need to update your skills or learn to do something a little different than what you've done. Um, but I think also there are two or three fundamental truths that remain. A, people want to buy from people. People don't want to buy from robots. Even worse, there's very little value in robots buying from robots, right? Like there's really no point there. And but that's kind of what we're almost headed for in some people's conception, right? Like if my AI is booking all the travel from your AI travel agent, then like I'm still buying the travel from you, right? So it's not displacing that entirely.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
The simile I like to make is, I can bring a forklift to the gym and I can lift any weight, but it's completely missing the point of me going to the gym, right? People want to buy from people. People value content generated from other people. Um, I think this whole, the prevalence of TikTok, the prevalence of OnlyFans, the whole kind of media landscape only supports this notion that ultimately what people want is connections with people. It's not just about buying the service. You're sitting in Chicago. I'm sure there's within 20 miles of you, there's got to be 3,000 lawyers, right? Somehow all of them make a living, right? It's not that their services aren't fundamentally fungible, right? They have to write a contract, but you pick a lawyer based on relationships, based on the way they conduct themselves, their philosophy, their family connection, whatever it is, right? But it still comes down to you're buying a fungible service, but you're buying it from a particular individual who you like or you don't like, or you might even switch to a different one, but you're getting the same product ultimately, right? So people want to buy from people. People want to deal with people. AI creating work for I think, is kind of missing the point. So I prefer to think of it as empowering. I don't know if you recall a time before our answer to "I wonder if" was "let's Google it," right? Like you had to go to like the Encyclopedia Britannica, or like order the book and wait for 3 weeks for it to arrive before you could answer the question. How empowering, how much faster, how much more productive have we become since we could just Google it? And for me, AI, especially the generative AI stuff, is basically like the next phase of let's just Google it, right? The trick is that if you just rely on AI without critical thinking, without taking on the responsibility for that 20, 30, whatever it is, percent imperfection in the AI, then you're going to end up with egg on your face and your brain's going to atrophy. But if you actually use it to power your creativity, if you actually use it to enable your ability to do things faster, then it's incredibly empowering, right? Like we could be digging dirt with our hands, but guess what? We use shovels and we use backhoes. Why? Because we can move more dirt faster. If you start viewing AI as your mental shovel to move more mental dirt faster, you can just get more stuff done. If we do get to great coding agents, how cool would it be if you could literally go build me a website to do X and suddenly X exists, right? How many more X's could we build? And yes, some of those X's would not be successful. So what, right? The point is, you as an individual could do so much more and get so much more out of your life. I am colorblind and I joke I'm ambidextrous. I can't draw, right? But now I can literally talk to an AI and generate the images that are in my mind, whether they are diagrams for business or whether they're just pictures that are for my soul because I want to see this picture realized. 5 years ago, I couldn't do it. I would have to hire an artist. So someone would say, well, but now that artist is unemployed. But the truth is, I would have never hired that artist. I would have just never generated that image.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's actually a good point. It's almost like, especially for small businesses, they can't even afford to hire people out of these instances for these things that they want to produce. So rather than hiring somebody, which they wouldn't have. They would use a tool, which still, in essence, especially if it's a smaller AI company, they're still paying a person, to be fair, which I guess is actually to your point. I had never considered it from that framing. And that's why I've been asking this question as a theme throughout. I've had a couple podcast episodes today, and I like asking this question because everyone's come at it from a different angle. But no, I think that's very true. We're still required to make a transaction with a person. I also think when it comes to the jobs side of things, some of what people do in their day to day, they've almost taken a bit of an approach that they value it very highly, not just because they'd have the paycheck, but it's like, oh, well, this is what I do for a living. I don't necessarily think people who are on the assembly line for like Ford or otherwise, prior to some of the more difficult or mundane tasks being, quote, mechanically automated, had a different response. But I think now if we look at it, we don't have a negative response to it occurring. But since now it's all knowledge work, like everything we do is, quote, knowledge work for the most part, the immediate response is negative. But just because it's all on the computer or it is digital does not necessarily mean that the skill or ceiling that you're trying to reach for yourself is actually anything else than equivalent to plugging in whatever it was in the widget on the assembly line. Like, not to be rude, but like, yeah, if you're just picking up a phone call and dealing with people asking for what's my password, like, I don't think anyone's actually being fulfilled out of that. So I thought that was an interesting point you made. And it's quite interesting, the dichotomy between, we all accept, well, yeah, it was stupid. People were like putting their hand on the assembly line and whatnot. It's like, well, we could also make that same assessment if we're being a little bit more objective about the situation here with some knowledge work jobs.
I think there's an important distinction that you're making or that you're implying between a task and a craft, right? A task is just a task. A craft is the thing that people pride themselves on having developed a special skill for. And actually, some people turn tasks into crafts, right? Like, a lot of coders view what they do as a craft, right? Like, I can make more beautiful code than you can is an expression of being a craft, as opposed to I'm just, building a house. Some bricklayers view what they do as a craft because they can make it perfect, and that's the guy you want laying your brick. Let's face it, right? But some guys are just like slop on the mud, throw on the brick, slop on the mud, right? So I think that where people get worked up, and understandably, is when they've spent lives or years honing a craft and becoming really good at it, and having their kind of self-image and their pride wrapped up in their ability to do that craft. And then that craft is reduced to margarine through automation, right? And you see that in musicians, and you see it in artists, and you see it in writers, and we've been seeing that for a long time. But now you're seeing it in software development, and next year you'll see it in legal associates, and the year after that you'll see it in junior doctors, right? The question is, how do you keep the human sort of need for differentiation and for kind of pride and for fulfillment still engaged when you're automating a part of the task? And I think, again, where I really believe in cooperative AI being the answer is, you get to do the stuff that's inevitably not the stuff that people focus on and view as being like the magic ingredient they add, but you can accelerate all the work that needed to happen before there, right? Like, nobody wants to spend 5 days mixing all the paints so they can paint the Sistine Chapel, but guess what, they had to until that stuff got automated, and then they could just squeeze the tube and the paint was ready to go. Same thing. This is an ongoing kind of process.
No, I completely agree with that. It's funny. Yeah, I'm trying to imagine that. Or even and I do think there is some beauty in the mundaneness of some things, but only for art, really. Like, only for art. And I think you're right on the difference between tasks and art. And I remember there was an interesting There's an interesting paper written by Bertrand Russell in like 1910 or 1912. No, it would have been after the First World War, so closer to 1920s, where he essentially made this argument. It was called In Praise of Idleness. His entire premise in this article was that we've arbitrarily been blowing each other up for the past like 7 years. It's going to be great now that we have robotics and like automation in what we've advanced even during the war, because, you know, half of the workforce wasn't really even working. So we can chill more now is basically his whole point. He's like, oh, so we can relax a little bit more. I think it was like kind of the first introduction of anybody even mentioning like a less than 5-day work week or 6-day work week at the time, probably, because they probably only took Sundays off, I think, probably in the 1920s. And it's funny because people, it's especially in American culture, consistent focus on, well, we got to work. We have to maximize. We got to work. We got to maximize. We got to work. This could be the actual adjustment towards more artistry and less tasks. I think if this goes well, I'd hope so. Right. Like if it doesn't, I'm trying to think, we will never get out of this cycle. Right. Like, you know what I
mean? You know, I think that what we've always seen, and this has been a continuing trend for millennia, is that as we expand our scope of attention, you know, as we can focus on more things have to go on autopilot underneath them, right? You know, when you were, for 100,000 years, we were scrabbling just to generate enough calories to survive, didn't have much time for anything else, right? When you actually started seeing some tools, suddenly we have the time to start painting cave walls, right? I'm eternally optimistic about the capacity of humanity to create new cool things, but you can only do them if you can liberate the time and energy that you spent on the thing before. So, you know, when people freak out about, you know, it's going to take all the jobs, like, again, I just don't believe that's what's going to happen, because, you know, in the 1950s, like, we didn't have yoga studios, and we didn't have, you know, hair, you know, blowing salons, and we didn't have like all the stuff that came out of the generation of more free time and more free wealth based on automation, based on the growth of the economy. And I don't know what the implications will be. I don't know what cool new things we will create, but there's going to be some subset of humanity that's going to continue to be creative, and that's going to create these new things that we can't even imagine today, that are going to appeal to and attract the attention of everybody else. You know, from the perspective of someone in the Middle Ages, the whole concept of a Renaissance fair, right? The ability to go somewhere for the weekend and pretend that you're, you know, living in Roman times or something, right, would seem crazy. But for us, large groups of us, it's not, right? Because we have the time, we have the free income, we can actually spend time doing this thing that's not fundamentally productive, because we have spare calories. You know, like, it comes down to spare calories and how you choose to spend them, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. My I mean, for full context, I'm 27, and there's a common. So I have both sides of my family are like first generation immigrants. So I've heard stories, and I do think there's a funny difference between people who have that experience of like close familial bonds of on the ground experiencing World War II and or the Great Depression. And when you don't have that, most people don't maybe see it the same way I was lucky enough to be presented it with as, but like the concept of people thinking that it's even anything close to as difficult as it was to live 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Like I have stories I could tell for days of what I heard from the people who were on the ground in that time. And I think it's AI actually is another ability for it to take another step forward, you know. That's why I bring forth that in praise of idleness thing, because I think as much as maybe Bertrand had a point, well, some would say, oh, well, we're not where he wanted us to be at yet, and it's been 100 years. It's like, well, also unlimited PTO. Have you heard of Uber Eats? You know, these types of very basic things that we just take for granted now, like oh no, my HOA costs too much. I'm like, yeah, also I have a pool. Like, it's like there are so many different, or for example, the AC in my building for the building was down, but the entire central AC for like individual units were fine. And like just these basic things, that we've gotten to with technology progress. I just like to ask questions about where do you think it's going to go for individuals in the future, because it's the one thing that is like esoteric is I don't think any of us have like a proper answer to the question, right? You watch the movie Back to the Future, and it was pretty far off, but pretty still, but we might hit that in 2100. But I guess my next question would be, what excites you most about this relationship between like humans and AI and the collaborative agents that you were discussing earlier? What kind of pushes you to keep wanting to work on this every day?
So, look, I'm actually a first generation immigrant. English was not my first language. And I was born in the Soviet Union.
Oh,
In the
wow. Okay.
yeah. Um, yeah. So, I maybe have a little bit of a different trip than most folks have had. Um, and I actually fundamentally think that my job on this earth right now is to show another model of working with AIs that's not zero sum. And I believe I genuinely believe that that's where we're headed, but also it doesn't mean that we have to get there. I've been fortunate enough to have multiple exits. I could be just sitting around sipping pinatas and playing hockey and having a good time. But I also feel like I have something to add to the conversation in terms of showing a model that I think is less destructive and less disruptive and more enabling. And that's actually mostly what gets me excited, in the morning. We've built this one solution, for example, that allows somebody in an emergency room setting to enter details of the patient presentation. In other words, like what they're complaining of and what are the symptoms that we've been able to ascertain. And it goes through the history of patients, like billing and diagnostic history, and does all the inference and basically can tell the person at that hospital, here are the three most likely things going on. Here are the tests you should do now to kind of evaluate if it's one of these things or something else. And what that, does that help the, the 30-year experience doctor in a hospital room in Scottsdale? No, probably not. But it probably does help the, the slightly qualified medic in some, reservation medical emergency room where they don't have access to that 30-year experience doctor, or that field hospital, in Kenya in the bush where they're trying to keep folks healthy even though they don't have access to that level of medical care. So, I think AI can help enable a lot of those capabilities in new and very powerful ways if it's channeled and if it's kind of implemented in a way that's thoughtful and that understands and deals with the realities of real world, the security, the reliability, the privacy, the legal frameworks in which it needs to operate, like all of that stuff that maybe people who haven't lived through as many of these sort of technology shifts as I have don't quite appreciate yet.
I mean, yeah, it's probably double layered because even what year did you leave the Latvia?
I left 74.
Yeah, I mean, with everything that was going on, I'd imagine that from a technological standpoint, you probably had like two whoa moments. I mean, moving here, I'm sure under the under the curtain, like everything was just kind of like late, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So you come here, you're like, what is this? Tangibly seeing that jump. Yeah. Wow. It's impactful. Yeah. Like one of the most grateful things I am is that like I have like immigrant parents, because it's just like, it's a little bit more humbling when you talk about everything and then you just hear Like, my mom's from Greece, my dad's from Italy, and the stories you hear are just like, okay. Like, I remember my no when we were talking one time about like what was school like, and in his broken English, he said like, school? What school? The Germans blew it up, and I was like, I was like, how old are you? He's like, 10. I'm like, 10. So yeah, now we're talking about all these like esoteric future capabilities with tech, and it's just like a crazy difference in reference. But it's amazing, and it's really cool that you have that background, because I think it speaks to the appreciation you probably have for where we're at now.
No, absolutely. And I'm still full of wonder in the sense that I think we've still only scratched the surface, and I think that we are going to see things that will seem miraculous, in hindsight. The quote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from,
It's indistinguishable from magic. Yep.
Put AI in front of somebody from even 30 years ago, and it's going to seem almost magical, right? Forget about 100 years.
Dude, I'm a nerd, and it looks magical to me, and I pay attention to it every day. So like,
You know what? I've also shared this experience where I've built something with my own hands, and then I run it, and I am mystified that it.
yeah, you go, what is this? What do you think the most interesting improvement for personal use is going to come out of AI and AI agents in the next like 5-10 years?
I think that the ability to personalize learning is going to be the greatest asset that folks have. So my wife's decided that she wants to learn Italian right now. Yeah. 5 prompts of ChatGPT equals, a year of Duolingo, right?
You know what? That's true. That's accurate. I agree.
And you can learn anything, right? It's all out there in a personal context. Again, corporate context, enterprise context, there's a few other complexities, and that's kind of where Autom8ly lives. But in a personal context, the empowerment and the ability, if you allow it to have the conversation rather than thinking of AI as a tool, is where the real power is.
What are your thoughts on I don't know if it's funny. I was actually going to talk about teaching and learning and languages. So it's very funny that you brought that up. Have you interacted at all with the pro version of ChatGPT, how they keep expanding the length of like being able to talk to it? It sounds better and better. Have you seen that people are using it to like train themselves on language?
Absolutely. And that's actually exactly what I'm speaking about when I talk about the.
No, it wasn't written. It was yeah.
Yeah, it's spoken, it's verbal. So I've actually made a point of always of playing with AI in other languages, because I'm fortunate enough to speak a couple of them. So I actually interact with AI in various languages, just to actually in part to understand what the difference is between English AI and other language AIs, because they're not really the same. We do tend to be very English centric in the AI universe, but also, yeah, it's very cool. The ability to converse brings about a different kind of thinking. I know that when I'm exploring ideas, even coding ideas, when I'm trying to solve like hard problems and trying to kind of really think through architectures, I walk my dogs and I talk to OpenAI and work through architecture, because I have the imagination, but I don't necessarily have the minute technical detail of all of the different tools that these cutting edge architectures are touching on. And guess what? AI does. So it's the combination of my imagination and the AI's access to knowledge, especially now that it has kind of live search tools and it's not limited to new in 2023. That's a very powerful, very enabling capability.
I think you're onto something there. My like main thing that I've really enjoyed in the last little bit is like even just So obviously chain prompting was the thing. And then O3 kind of threw that out the window from what I can tell, because it does its own like reasoning, right? Reasoning models threw it out the window, I should say. And yeah, I remember mentioning to the co-host of the podcast, Idekin, about 7 months ago when we first started, saying, man, I can't wait for the instance where ChatGPT, from an API standpoint, or any of these tools, these language models from an API standpoint, it gets access to the internet. It's about to go crazy. It's going to be incredible. And then now we're 7 months later in, and we're already like we've already hedonically adapted to the fact that not only obviously on the front end it was available, I think last October you could like web search, but people don't appreciate like this thing can keep running and look stuff up and go through.
You just expect it now because it feels natural.
Yeah, and it's only been half a year, and I'm just still baffled that, like, when it was released, I was like, this is like, do people not realize this is it? Like, this is the moment where nonstop this thing can learn, or what? And yeah.
So we at my house we celebrate New Year's instead of Christmas. So for New Year's of 2023, so like 2 years ago, I tried to use image generation to generate Happy New Year's cards for everybody, just as an experiment. So that all those models were trained basically in 2022 and in early 23. And so every time I tried to generate a Happy New Year card, it said 2022 on it, even though it was 2023, because all the images that it was trained on had 2022 in them, right? That's only a year and a half ago. And now the image generation has gone so far, like that's not even something that you could contemplate happening now. And now I'm using images to generate, technical diagrams with words and arrows and all that stuff. Then a year and a half ago, I was trying to generate Happy New Year 2023, right? So to your point, the rate of improvement of this stuff is incredible. It's going to take us a long time as a society, and especially as an enterprise and corporate society, to understand how that blends into our work, how that blends into our legal framework, into our copyright framework, into our our ownership of IP framework, all of these sort of concepts that now have to catch up with the capability, right? So we are in the very early days. It's going to take a minimum of 5 years for all that stuff to kind of pass through the meat grinder and come out as something at the end of it. And so I kind of view my job as to kind of try and imagine what that looks like, but also I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it too. And I know everyone's probably really excited for it as well. If you want to learn, or if you want to, please, just as we close it out, could you please give us a final plug for everything that you are doing over at Autom8ly so that everyone can check you out?
Sure. Thank you. So we work with enterprises and companies to help them understand how to bring AI automation to their processes. As I said, we focus on cooperative AI, where we think of AI as a colleague rather than a tool, and help you understand how to implement it in ways that can bring value today rather than sometime in the future, where when it becomes perfect suddenly. And we do it with full recognition of your needs as a corporation, all the way through to being able to do fully encrypted inference and other cool cutting edge things that allow you to be compliant and use some of the AI tools that your employees use in their everyday lives and want to use at work, but can't.
Sounds great. Well, make sure to go to autom8ly.com. That is spelled AUTOM8, the number, LY.com. Thank you so much for watching this episode, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.